something to keep an eye on out as we continue to work on this project. And finally, critical minerals. And before I talk a little bit about the research, I just want to tell you how we got into this space. So about 2.5 years ago, one of my colleagues, Mike Toman, started to say, hey, you know, I'm hearing a lot about critical minerals. This is starting to be, you know, conversation. Let's dig in. And so what we did was we set up a whole slew of interviews with the federal government, agencies, representatives and so on, to get a sense of like, what are they thinking when it comes to critical minerals? What are the challenges? Where should we be thinking? And what we saw was that the conversations around policies were almost exclusively focused on geopolitical issues and science. And there was this gap in terms of environmental economics or economics more broadly, and how, you know, thinking about things like costs and prices and incentives and the market structure, right? This was not making it into the conversations that were being had around critical minerals, and thus it was not coming into the policy making. So we saw an opportunity for us to get involved as economists and really be able to contribute to the conversation. And so one of the big things that we wanted to really do was sort of capacity building. And what does that mean? Is increasing a broad understanding about economics, trying to get more people to incorporate economics into conversations around policy. And one example of what we've been doing over the past year is I've been leading this critical minerals research lab, which brings together PhD students from all over the country. They're all interdisciplinary, the idea being that they can work together and get input on each other's work and sort of start to see the issues in not such a siloed manner. So that's something that we did last year. We're doing it again next year, and I'm really excited for the second cohort. Another big area of our research is environmental and social sustainability of critical minerals. So understanding sort of, you know, how can we reduce the environmental and social impacts of extraction and processing through policy and private action. And finally, supply chain economics, really just thinking about the entire supply chain from mineral extraction all the way up to battery production and vehicle production. And, you know, how do these different links of the supply chain interact, and where can we leverage policy to make sure that our supply chain is sustainable and secure? And so within this space, one of the questions we're asking is about America First policies for minerals, really thinking, can America go it alone in terms of extraction? Is it sort of feasible? And if so, at what cost? And so the first step is to say, you know, how do the known domestic resources that we have in the US compared to what we actually need for electric vehicles, and what percentage of those resources are actually economically extractable? So that's what you see in the green is the economically extractable reserves in the United States. And what we found is that, you know, for lithium, we have a ton of really economically extractable minerals, but not for cobalt or nickel, right? In fact, cobalt, we don't even have enough resources to sort of go it alone. And for nickel, though we have a ton of resources, it's not economically extractable. So this really, I think, highlights how it's really hard for America to go it alone. And these America First policies are going to have to be really considerate of the fact that we just don't have all of the minerals. So that concludes my presentation, and happy to just have a broader conversation about the work that we're doing within the space.
Thanks a lot, Beia. All very important and interesting work. You know, executing electrification and decarbonization of transportation is multifaceted. Is a multifaceted challenge, as you point out. And, you know, also in critical minerals, there's absolutely been this gap and need for more applied economic research. You know, the conversation has really kind of amplified voices or expertise on the more technical or geopolitical side. So it's good to have more economists thinking about these topics. But let's spend some time digging into the supply chain economics research a bit more, starting with this rare earths research that you've mentioned. You know, has the game theory perspective that you're working with provided insight into China's trade policy decisions recently and how they may or may not play out? You know, are there export ban threats credible long-term across markets? You know, what have you found here?
Yeah, well, we decided to look at this question from a game theory perspective because it's sort of interesting for us to think about, can China effectively withhold exports and do so sort of in the long run, right? So, and one of the big reasons why this is particularly different from other critical minerals is that China is like the primary processor of rare earth elements across the world, right? So 90% of these elements are processed in China. So it's really hard to get the products from other countries. But so what China did here was, work to create these licenses so that purchasers, have to like ask for permission to buy these rare earths, and then they can't just resell it. And I think that resell bit is sort of the key, because if China just sort of restricted to certain countries, the banned countries could just go ahead and purchase the rare earth elements or the magnets from the non-banned countries, and we pay a little bit more for shipping, but it's sort of like an ineffective way of doing it. So these licenses were really trying to target that resale. And so from an econ perspective, like, what benefit is there? Like, this was the first question we asked, right? From an economic perspective, how does China benefit from doing this ban? And so one reason may be to leverage market power, right? Let's restrict supply so that prices go up, you capture more of the rent, right? But the issue is in the long run, right? If supply prices are high, that's a great thing for investors to come in and start extraction. And especially here in the United States, where we've been ramping up innovation and extraction and extracting rare earth elements from mine waste, from acid mine drainage and coal ash. And so high world prices for REs would be a huge boon for the US industry, right? And so does China really want the rest of the world ramping up their production and processing of rare earth elements? Probably not, right? Even though they would benefit from it in the short run with higher prices, it really just ends up harming their market power in the sector. So we didn't think that it was credible from like, if you really start to take into account, like, what happens when prices go up when supply is restricted. So I think what we were sort of saying in the paper is, hey, it's probably, these restrictions are sort of a short-term negotiation strategy. Let's leverage this to sort of gain political benefit or, retaliation against Trump administration because of the tariffs, and then release the exports once you've gotten what you want. And that's effectively what we saw, right? So China temporarily suspended back in the mid-May the export ban to 28 US companies. But because they've set up these licenses, they could always revoke them in the future. So it seems like something that could be like start and stop, but it doesn't give a lot of, for investors who are thinking about ramping up extraction here in the United States, it just doesn't give them a lot of security.
Yeah, absolutely, and it certainly played out in that way in which you've characterized it in terms of a bargaining chip, and it is interesting with the rare earth discussion, given such small market sizes and the fact that it's for a lot of the producers in the U.S. it's more about economic viability than it is about whether it's technically feasible, and I think again like this, considering whether the threat is credible in the long term is important consideration. But let's think for a second about your research more broadly on market power, because as you mentioned, this concentration of Chinese capacity is not unique to rare earths, though the rare earth markets are unique. I think most are aware that China maintains increasing market shares in the production, processing, and refining of most transition critical minerals. So, beyond rare earths, how might this market power translate into distortions? And what are the key concerns and implications for policymakers in the US beyond just supply diversification,
Yeah. Well, I think that the main concern here really is, potential for market power to affect prices, right? So we're largely dependent on one big supplier. Then they can fluctuate prices up or down, right? They can fluctuate them up to sort of gain more rent, or they can drop them to sort of price out other investors. And this is real problematic because critical mineral markets already face a lot of price volatility. So we look at how prices have varied over the past, 5-10 years, like they're kind of all over the place, right? And so what I think we should be focusing on is, what does this really mean for investors? Because I think that it's hard for an investor here in the United States to say, I'm going to get into this game, right? I'm going to get into this game, even though the prices are all over the place. Although we do see some movement. And so, where are we seeing a lot of movement? Where we're seeing most movement, I think, in lithium, which kind of makes sense from like that figure that I showed you, which showed we have a lot of it and it's economically extractable, right? But what I think is like really interesting to see which are the lithium projects that are moving forward the fastest. And I'm just going to give you an example, which is the direct lithium extraction in Arkansas, in the Texarkana region. And like, why might this be happening, right? Because if we go back to price volatility and what that means for investors, right? They need to kind of move quickly, right? Because, oh, hey, it might ramp up. The prices might ramp up. They might ramp down. Like something's going to happen. If we have, let's say the prices are high right now, let's get into this game and let's do it really quickly. And it takes a really long time to set up traditional mines in the United States. But what we're seeing in Arkansas, which is a place where has a long history of oil and gas extraction, it also has a long history of bromine extraction, interestingly. And so this is an area where the community has been really like into the type of extraction. There's sort of social license to operate, right? They've been working in the extraction space. Regulators are really open to it. And so we see it sort of picking up steam. And so the federal government has also realized like, hey, we need to not be the hurdle, right? We need to get out of the way of the companies and let them come in and do things faster. And so the Trump administration has been fast tracking permitting. But even if the federal government fast tracks permit, that's not enough for you to actually move forward fast, because you need state government approval, right? The state government decides like, are you going to pay royalties? How, what's that percentage that you're going to be? You might need to comply with other permits at the state level, right? And then you need community buy-in, right? The communities need to give you the social license to operate so that you can avoid potentially long delays due to litigation. So that's one of the issues, right? Which is just, we're going to be seeing likely a large pickup in areas where there's already a social license to operate. People are already bought in. The state regulators are on board. And so I think it'd be interesting to see how this develops over space. And then I just want to, one extra point, which is for mines who are already in place, one of the worst things that can happen is that mineral price dropping, because the mine might end up going into care and maintenance and they're not producing anything. And this happened last year at the Sibanye-Stillwater nickel mine in Montana when nickel prices dropped. And so they went into care and maintenance, and that's really bad for the local community, right? They probably depended on the royalties, maybe the jobs from the mine. They've already, given up whatever environmental impact due to the fact that this big mine was built, right? And so it's really key for companies and for communities that these mines that are already built continue to operate. The more price volatility there is, the less likely we're going to have, functioning operating plants that continue to operate, into the future. So we definitely want to avoid that type of situation. And the question is like, are there policies that can help stabilize the prices so that these mines can continue to operate and not go into care and maintenance?
Absolutely. And I'd like to come back to the DOE topic a bit. It is an interesting case here with lithium in particular. And, you've touched on policies that sort of are favorable to maintaining this sort of increasing US presence in critical mineral production. But let's unpack that a bit more in terms of the objective, right? To kind of really what we're talking about is US competitiveness across critical mineral supply chains. And on one hand, you've seen these policies, as you mentioned, to kind of streamline the permitting process or kind of reduce barriers to initiating a project. But on the other hand, some of the policy objectives of the current administration will really translate to will translate into difficulties for all transition critical mineral markets. And I think we see varying importance of the expected energy transition demand across different critical minerals. And I think for lithium, it's something like up to 90% of demand. And even for these minerals like copper that represent a smaller portion of demand, a lot of the growth is expected to come from the energy transition. So you kind of have these like policies or initiatives at odds. I think we've talked about this a bit. Would you mind spending some time kind of unpacking that and what implications it might have for U.S. competitiveness and what that might mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to ask, like, what's the objective here? Like, why do we want to bring mineral production into this country? It's obviously more expensive to produce. That's why we haven't had a lot of extraction in this country to date, right? And it's more expensive because labor costs are higher. There's more regulatory issues that you have to deal with. And so it makes us just effectively less competitive at creating this product. And so then you have to start to ask, like, well, so why do we want to do it, right? Because from a decarbonization standpoint, that was our goal. It would be better just to get, less expensive minerals from abroad and keep the costs of our transition down. But, I think there's other rationales for doing it. And one of the things that we've talked about is this market power. Can we insulate ourselves from the market power, right? And I think to a certain degree, I'm not sure that we can just by having an industry here in the United States. Because just because you have a company that's extracting lithium or whatever other mineral does in the United States does not mean that they're only going to sell to the United States. They could be selling it globally. So if prices are sort of high or fluctuating, these prices are going to follow them. Obviously, if there's, a offtake agreement, then you sort of secure your supply and you're not worried about price fluctuations, you're not worried about price restrictions or supply restrictions from the rest of the world, right? So it's one way that you can sort of insulate yourself, but you need that offtake. And how does that offtake happen? It's going to happen if you have a growing EV demand and renewables demand in this country with companies who are willing to pay extra for those minerals. But they're willing to pay extra because it's offtake, so it's a secure supply, but they're also willing to pay more because we know that people here want to pay more for minerals that are extracted here in the United States, right? Like something that people value, right? And so with a sort of captive buyer who's willing to pay more, then it kind of makes sense to ramp up extraction, even if it's more costly to do this in the United States. And I think that's what was so interesting about the IRA tax credits that had that provenance restriction, right? That said, well, you can get the tax credit if the minerals either are domestically produced or produced in friendly nations. But if you take that away, and in fact, you impose all these policies that try to reduce as much as possible demand and manufacture of electric vehicles and renewable energy, you no longer have this captive market. You no longer have buyers who are willing to pay more, right? Because the demand has disappeared. And so I think that these two ideas that we're just going to be able to ramp up extraction in the United States not for us to use, but for us to export, because somehow that's going to, make us more competitive, but we're not going to be competitive unless you put in extra policies to support, reduced costs. So now we're just subsidizing companies to export the minerals to other parts of the world. So I think it's just a sort of a strange thing. On the other hand, you might be saying, well, there's another rationale. And the other rationale is more industrial policy. We want manufacturing in this country. We want these jobs, right? But in a country that has relatively low unemployment, right? Is this industry actually creating new jobs? Or are we just pulling workers from other sectors, right? So is it a positive outcome, or is it just like a net zero benefit, right? How do these new jobs compare in terms of wages, in terms of benefits that they can give to the workers and to the local community? Are they more risky than alternatives? Are we causing more potential, health crises amongst the workers or not? Will the jobs be given to people who live locally, or are people going to be commuting, migrating from other parts of the country? I don't think any of these questions have been definitively answered. And so we're working right now on looking at this specific question in the Texarkana region when it comes to direct lithium extraction, to ask the question, like, what are the skill sets that are necessary to work in DLE? How do those overlap with the oil and gas workers who currently already live there and are working in that area? What else is needed? How do the wages compare? How do the royalties collected sort of differ from, oil and gas? It's really just understand, is this a real boom to the economy or not? And also, right, not for nothing, but mining and processing can create environmental impacts, right? And a lot of these minerals are located in close vicinity to tribal lands. Groups who have already been overburdened from, environmental pollution and other economic challenges, right? So are we really going to be harming them even more by doing that? Now, the federal government may be willing to overlook this issue, but I think as critical researchers, we should be the ones that are asking these questions and providing evidence to policymakers about the benefits of actually increasing extraction here in the United States. What benefits can it actually provide, and what's it costing us to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, sorry, the echo on my side. Yeah, I mean, and earlier you made an important point around the sort of the threat of the policy change to domestic mineral demand. And I think it's worth emphasizing that it's both a question of the total quantity of demand, right? So as we roll back some of these policies, how much total offtake is there available, but also the other side of this, but is really on the incentive to buy locally in terms of the local content requirements that, unlock these tax subsidies. So, it does, deal a double blow to this US sector, but it's also worth pointing to the fact that for a lot of these minerals, we're not actually vulnerable to raw material imports. Really, a lot of our imports are embedded in these other products. And we think a lot about, okay, sure, it's the actual mining, but also the refining that's concentrated in China. And in terms of how it flexes market power, I think, and you mentioned this with rare earths. And then sometimes I think this capacity or overcapacity may be strategic, or it may not be. I think we're seeing in the copper market right now, this more demand from refiners than can be met from the mines. It's actually a great thing for the miners of copper at this point. But I think it also points to the fact that there's many stages in between copper mine or lithium mine in the US and electric vehicle. And we have to think where the entire supply chain is located. And I think you pointed to this in your slide deck, but okay, let's set aside these market power and market concentration concerns. There's not even geologic availability of most of these minerals. And for this whole suite of reasons, these partnerships with friendshoring it's really essential to, be it national security concerns or energy transition. And I'll just take a moment to mention that's where a lot of our work has come in, and thinking and adding to this analysis a lot of the same questions that you're asking about the US, like how can it deliver local benefits, how can you ensure social license to operate? What is your local royalty structure? These are the ones that, we're addressing with our partners as well, particularly in Brazil at the moment. And, they are debates and discussions that have been around for a long time, and they're absolutely not getting any less relevant. So I think as we explore this in the US context, it's also worth considering how that might apply into the global context where we, as demand are also kind of responsible for that, because we don't want to kind of, okay, let's say that environmental impact for the lithium extraction is, does not occur in the Southwest or where that mine might be developed. But if the demand is there, it would, kind of relocalize or occur elsewhere. And we need to think about the responsibility of American demand. But, let's come back to the lithium discussion. And, this is an area, as you point out, where perhaps the US can be kind of cost competitive. And it's interesting to see, this appetite for direct lithium extraction, DLE, which is quite nascent. But I think as I understand it, your team's been spending a lot of time speaking with folks around this, and you think that there's particular kind of opportunity here. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, broadly, I think DLE is the one that has been identified as having like the greatest opportunity for extraction, particularly like in the Salton Sea. I've heard it said that, oh, well, the Salton Sea could provide a third of, the lithium that we need for electric vehicles. There's just like a huge amount just coming out of one location. So it's very promising, but you're right. It's a totally nascent technology that needs to be developed. It's very site specific as well, which I think makes it really, really challenging. So we're looking in Texarkana specifically about DLE in oil and gas fields, and we decide to approach this question mainly from like a just transition point of view, which is like, all right, oil and gas is on its way out, right? What it remains for these communities who depend so much on this industry, and can DLE provide sort of a future for these communities that are so dependent on extraction? One of the things that we had thought was possible when we first started getting into this space was, oh, well, when you're actually fracking or you're, taking out the oil and gas, this brine comes out, right? So the brine's the stuff that has the water that has the lithium in it. And so we thought, ooh, maybe we could be doing co-production as well. But we had a couple conversations with companies in the space, and they just flat out said that's not a good idea at all, because the oil and gas is like a nuisance that makes it really hard to extract the lithium from the brine. And so what they're actually looking at is like, we need to go and dig new wells because those old wells that we have are already contaminated. So I thought it was a little bit less of a home run, because if you think like, well, could you just reconfigure your existing wells, and you don't have to make new wells? It's less of an impact, sort of spatial impact. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. But there's a lot of excitement down there, and I just want to point out a couple things that I found with this project that I thought was really interesting, which has to do with sort of like this workforce element. There was a government grant, a state government grant was given to produce these two sort of sister organizations called Lithium Learns and Lithium Works. And so Lithium Learns was saying, hey, there's skills that we need to give to the people who are going to come and work at these DLE locations. And so they're thinking K-12 education, right? Ramping up curricula, bringing in teachers who can provide that information, creating mobile labs for the students who are interested in doing it, so that when they graduate, they're able to either do a 1 year extra training, or they can go directly into this field. Lithium Works, on the other hand, is more focused on like people who already have the training and sort of gathering, creating a forum or some sort of area where all the different workforce, so it's not just people working at the wells, but like the cooks and clothes suppliers and plumbers and things like that that you need to support this industry, to get them all together in one place that just sort of facilitates hiring locally, for example. So I think there is an opportunity here for these communities to continue to grow with this extraction. But yeah, I mean, it's challenging, right? If they don't have offtake agreements, like where exactly is this lithium going to go? We're currently in a lithium supply glut, right? So prices are really low. I think it's interesting to see Exxon and Chevron like coming into this space. They're really gung ho about it. And it's I think it does raise the question of like, where are they expecting to sell it? One of the companies that we talked with was like, hey, for us, vertical integration is key to making this work, right? So we want to be able to extract, process, and have an offtake agreement, all that chain right here. And that was like a key part of their, economic framework. So again, like if we kill demand for these minerals, particularly battery minerals and lithium, which, as you say, 80 whatever percent of the lithium produced goes to electric vehicle batteries, we're killing off that demand. How do we get those offtake agreements that might be so necessary to continue to support that mine and the community more broadly?
Absolutely. And, I'll just, emphasize a couple points that you raised there. I think the skills training is very important because over the past few decades, mining hasn't been the most interesting industry for, American college graduates. And there's been sort of, we've seen this kind of underinvestment or lack of interest in entering the mining industry. So I think, bringing in the local training and investing in American capability is also essential for any even beginning to think about any U.S. competitiveness. The other point is that it is interesting to hear about the co-production with DLE. I mean, this is such an important consideration in most critical minerals markets. I mean, coming back to the rare earths, like when it comes to some of these, like you could solve the supply constraint by adding germanium processing at a zinc refinery or adding some processing at an additional mine. So I think it's interesting to hear that, and it's absolutely something that is a unique case when it comes to production economics that we should be thinking about as researchers.
Oh, can I
So,
add something on that co-production thing,
yeah.
which I think is really interesting, what the point that you made. I actually heard an economist talking about this at a conference a couple of years back. He was saying that there was a company that was producing mineral X, and I don't remember what it was, but that they had the opportunity to co-produce one of these rare earth elements. But they actually said that if they were to do that, invest in that, the amount of rare earth elements that they would be creating would be so large that it would flood the market. Right. And so they didn't even want to get into that space because otherwise, like their whole like economic rationale for going into it was, not there. And I said, well, why don't they just sell a portion of it? But I just thought it was like an interesting thing that you can get so much out of this co-production. And the sort of the market forces need to be there to support that decision.
Absolutely, and especially with a lot of these that are like sort of most critical to the national security concerns, we're actually talking about such small size of demand that I mean, exactly as you mentioned, there's such unique considerations. And the other thing that's interesting, as you mentioned, I mean, the incredible supply glut with lithium, even before these policy rollbacks, right? So even further, like erosion of demand. But potentially, if we see these large oil companies that have been around, or as we also start to see more major mining companies enter the lithium space, they might be more willing or more able to absorb some of these riskier technologies and to spend more time thinking about, vertical
Mm.
integration, you say. I think one of the unique things about the lithium market is, up until recently, it was really these junior miners and small scale miners sometimes entering mineral markets with their first project, which so in terms of like the cancellations and delays that we see, right, they're more sensitive to these market risks. So maybe as we see, these acquisitions and incumbents entering the lithium market, despite this supply gap, maybe we will see some, more stability in the novel extraction technologies.
Yeah,
So
maybe. And I also just want to make another point on that, because these large companies, and particularly these large companies that are deciding to come in and build mines, they have an opportunity to make really sustainable mines. And so
yeah,
one really great example of this is the Quellaveco mine in Peru. This mine has taken like so many steps to be sustainable, from autonomous electric vehicles operating there to water recycling and on-site energy, like renewable energy production and battery storage, to really thinking about where are we getting the water from? So one really cool thing I just want to mention, like they really care also about the community and sort of the impacts of the community. They've been working a lot with the community. And there was this river that passed right through the middle of their mine location. And the community was like, this river is really important to us. So they basically like created like a little tunnel for the river to go through. And rather than extract any water from that, they were getting their water from a river that was like 90 kilometers away, that was already contaminated with like arsenic and other like chemicals, to use that on site. And so I
wow.
think that these large companies nowadays can get really creative about how do we do this in a way that's sustainable. And that also provides another benefit, right? Because I think people would be willing to pay more for minerals that are coming from these sustainable mines. And so whereas we usually would think like, oh, well, it's really good to have a lot of competitors. In fact, I think the large ones have a greater opportunity to provide this sort of value add of sustainable mining to the supply.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do hope that there's this appetite for green premium in responsible mining and we just have 10 minutes left here, so I will take a couple questions here from the audience before we wrap up. One of them is just more touching back on RFF's role in this space. And pointing to the fact that there's overlap with the work that RFF is doing and what some of the national labs are doing, like NREL. But we've also seen this, these substantial budget cuts affecting a lot of these national labs. So where do you think the role is for independent think tanks like, RFF or JFI to kind of take the mantle here with this evolving landscape?
Yeah, I mean, if we don't have federal funding for this type of research, it's a challenge also for us organizations, right? Where do we get the funding from? I think up until January, we were really hopeful that the DOE would continue to fund this research because it is important. I do still think that federal funding of this research is really important, particularly now that they're so excited about mineral extraction, right? It does seem like this would be a great area to invest in research. I always think that independent research organizations are key to answering this question, because if we're advocates, we have an objective in mind, right? And so we can skew the conversation in a way that makes the results look like what we want to look like, right? But so at places like RFF, where we're not partisan and we're non-advocacy, right? What we're doing is we're just showing the outcomes of our research to help inform policymaking. And so that way, right?
Right.
The government and the policymakers know that they have a trusted source to be able to make decisions. So I think, regardless of what's happening with the funding, there's always a role for independent think tanks to provide some really robust research about, these questions, and particularly from an economics angle, because just again, like there's so much happening on the geopolitical front, and just this solid like America first, like let's do it because we do everything great in this country, that, like, yes, we have high labor standards, and yes, we have high environmental standards, but let's talk about the cost here. Let's talk about the costs, and let's talk about the benefits in a really sort of objective manner. And that's the role that we have to continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, there's actually a couple of questions about RFF's work in particular and on the modeling side. One of them is, I believe you may have mentioned this in your slide deck, but have you, with your transportation model, do you have a sense of how these, IRA rollbacks, which we've, discussed in detail, do you have a sense of what those might mean for vehicle emissions reductions, right, in the short to long term?
Yeah. I will say this is something that we're working on right now.
Yeah.
It's I think there's different things that we need to compare it to. And let me just, just for the to as like a baseline, what we're doing is we're leveraging this market model of demand and supply for light duty vehicles that we've been, our one of our fellows, Josh Lynn, has been building over the past several years. It's an econometric model that really is based on observed data. So we really like this model. It can tell us what happens when we turn on and off a lot of different policies that are either targeted towards demand or supply. And so the first step that we did was just say, let's just turn off all these policies, right? So let's turn off the IRA, let's turn off the waivers, turn off the emissions standards, and then see what happens. What we're planning on doing, we've got this project that we are, sort of launching now. We're trying to get some funding to do it as well, is to say, let's do this a little bit more sequentially, right? Let's turn off the IRA tax credit, but leave the other things in play. Or turn off the IRA and the waiver and leave the emission standards. Because it really depends. There's these really interesting interactions amongst the different policies. And so one of the things, like so Josh, in a paper that he wrote, it was like a couple of years ago, he basically found that having the California mandates actually allowed the federal government to put a more stringent emission standards. And so when you take one away, what happens to, the stringency or the allowed stringency of the emission standards, for example, or what happens to the cost of actually trying to go after an EV mandate if you don't have the emission standards? So understanding, like, it's hard for me to say what happens with subsidies. Well, what else is in play, or what else isn't in play? And we can't talk about these things completely independently because there's just so much like correlate or intricacies between the different policies that can have some sort of strange outcomes depending on which one you turn off and which one you turn on.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, the interaction between the state level and federal level policies, especially with California, which, has been known to move the needle even before these federal policies were in play. So that's an important consideration. I think we have time for one last question. So you might have to answer in broad strokes to protect the integrity of your modeling work. But the question was on the policy modeling side, in particular on the question of differential consumption under different subsidies. How did your team go about estimating the size of this effect? Is there an underlying behavioral model here? So you're accounting for price effects, some premium the users will place on eco-friendliness, or is it more reduced form estimation?
So I think talked about this a little bit in my previous answer, which is, we have this econometric model of the vehicle demand and supply. So this this model, it basically assumes consumers are sort of maximizing their utility, like what the benefit that they get out of choosing a vehicle of a specific make, model, and trim. Manufacturers are profit maximizing, subject to a group of regulations. This is a model that we do intend to have it be open source, and so we will be posting it, but we have to wait until a couple papers get published. So it is going to be really transparent. That being said, if you look at some of Josh Lynn's papers, especially the one that he published a couple years ago on the tax credits, you can get a really in-depth understanding of what that model looks like. So it's not reduced form, it's not diff and diff, it's more of it's a structural model.
Right. Right. Yeah, one of the projects that we've worked on now, which we're probably going to be working with a version of it soon, is thinking more about how investors in these emerging climate technologies respond to these policies that really seek to close the gap with the green premium. And the thought is that really the idea is that you have this you have the kind of the cost of the incumbent technology and then the cost of the emerging green technology, which is some degree higher. And the goal is right to get to market liftoff, right, where that gap is closed. But I think a lot of we found that when it comes to looking at especially like electricity generating technologies, or novel energy technologies more broadly, there's this gap in how we consider the role of investors in the space and what specific constraints investors might have. So we developed an agent-based model that kind of allows more flexible representation of the investors. So I think you'll find that interesting. The work should be live here in some time. But that's straying from the topic of discussion around critical minerals. So I think we're at time. But Beia, thank you again for joining us today. It's been just a great discussion on many different topics. Really exciting to see the work that you and your team are doing, and look forward to keeping the conversation going.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and for everyone for joining or for watching at home. And I will just say we have everything we do is public. It's available on rff.org. So come check us out. And yeah, you can read more about what we do there.
Thanks, everyone.